When you think of Henry VIII's children, images of the fierce Bloody Mary or the majestic Elizabeth I likely come to mind. Yet, there was another, Edward VI, the boy king whose short reign unveiled a darkness even his infamous father might have found unsettling. Ascending the throne at just 9 years old, Edward's transformation from an innocent child into one of England's most authoritarian rulers left a shadow that would haunt the Tudor dynasty forever. This isn't simply a tale about a sickly boy who died too young. It's a story about how absolute power can corrupt, no matter the age of the one who wields it. What you're about to learn about Edward's final days will challenge everything you thought you knew about the Tudor legacy. It was 1537 when Henry VIII finally got what he longed for, a legitimate male heir. Edward's birth was hailed as the resolution to years of dynastic uncertainty. But his arrival came at a heartbreaking price. His mother, Jane Seymour, died just 12 days after his birth, leaving the infant prince motherless and even more precious to his increasingly paranoid father. From the very beginning, Edward was seen not as a child, but as England's future savior, constantly surrounded by guards, tutors, and courtiers who reinforced his divine destiny. This early isolation from ordinary childhood life marked the first step toward the creation of a troubled ruler. Unlike his sisters Mary and Elizabeth, both of whom had faced their father's harshness and rejection, Edward knew only praise and unwavering adoration. Perhaps driven by guilt over how he treated his daughters, Henry lavished his son with near-worshipful attention. Edward received the best education money could buy, but these were no ordinary tutors. Hand-picked radical Protestant theologians were tasked with shaping Edward into the ideal Protestant monarch. From as young as 6, Edward's education went far beyond the usual lessons in Latin and Greek. He was immersed in complex theological texts that condemned Catholicism and preached the divine right of Protestant rulers to wield absolute power. In truth, Henry VIII's carefully arranged education was less about learning and more about indoctrination. Edward's main tutor, John Check, was not only a brilliant scholar but also a fierce religious zealot who painted vivid pictures of England as a New Jerusalem purified from the corruption of Catholicism. Every subject, history, philosophy, even politics, was taught through the narrow lens of Protestant supremacy and royal absolutism. By the time Edward was 8, he could eloquently argue that Catholics deserved death and that opposing his future reign was the same as defying God himself. What made his upbringing so dangerous was this toxic mix of intellectual brilliance and profound emotional isolation. Though capable of debating theology with university professors, Edward had never experienced normal childhood. No playdates, no friendships, no real human connection. His world consisted solely of adults who treated him with almost religious reverence. This created a boy who understood political power deeply, but had little empathy or appreciation for individual life. This perilous combination of razor-sharp intellect and emotional stunting shaped everything about his reign. In the autumn of 1547, England found itself ruled by a 9-year-old king who truly believed he was God's chosen instrument on earth. Edward VI inherited not just a crown, but a kingdom torn apart by religious conflict, one molded by the most radical Protestant minds Henry could find. And unlike his sisters Mary and Elizabeth, who had faced their father's wrath, Edward had been sheltered, praised, and told from birth that he was destined for greatness. This dangerous mix of divine entitlement and childish stubbornness would prove fatal for thousands of Edward's subjects. The England he inherited was a tinderbox of religious conflict. Though his father had severed ties with Rome and founded the Church of England, the nation remained sharply divided among Catholics, moderate Protestants, and radical reformers. First, Edward's Regency Council, led by his uncle Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, promised a more balanced rule. But the young king had his own vision for England's future. From his very first council meetings, Edward showed a disturbing blend of petulance and cold calculation, interrupting seasoned advisers to lecture them on Protestant doctrine with surprising authority. Contemporary witnesses were struck by how quickly the 9-year-old king asserted himself. Within weeks of his coronation, Edward personally reviewed death sentences and displayed a chilling eagerness to execute those he labeled heretics. Court records from this time reveal a boy who treated matters of life and death as mere intellectual puzzles, debating theological reasons for punishment with the same detachment he might apply to Latin grammar. Observers even noted that Edward would smile while signing death warrants, seemingly pleased by his own skill in finding scriptural justification for each execution. His early reign was marked by what courtiers quietly called religious tantrums, violent outbursts of anger whenever anyone dared suggest a more moderate approach to religious policy. Edward had absorbed his tutor's lessons so deeply that he truly believed any compromise with Catholic practices was nothing less than a betrayal of Christ himself. When an advisor cautiously proposed allowing some Catholic nobles to worship privately, Edward reportedly flew into a rage, hurling his inkwell across the room and shouting that God would punish England for such weakness. At first, these outbursts were brushed off as childish tantrums, but they revealed the emergence of a dangerously fanatic mind. Perhaps most unsettling was Edward's complete absence of normal childhood interests. While other boys his age played with toys and enjoyed games, Edward spent his free hours poring over accounts of the Spanish Inquisition, meticulously taking notes on interrogation methods. His personal servants later discovered disturbing drawings in his chambers, graphic depictions of torture techniques annotated with Edward's own commentary on their effectiveness for extracting confessions from heretics. The boy who should have been learning to ride horses and play outside was instead fixated on mastering the most brutal ways to break both bodies and spirits, all in the name of his rigid Protestant vision. What made Edward truly dangerous was the deadly fusion of religious fanaticism and absolute royal power. While his advisors schemed behind the scenes, the boy king absorbed every lesson about the divine right of kings with chilling zeal. His detailed journals from this time reveal a child who took grim pleasure in recounting executions, religious persecutions, and the suffering of those he condemned as heretics. By the age of 10, Edward was writing sermons that echoed throughout churches across England, fiery calls for the total eradication of Catholic influence and divine wrath upon anyone who showed mercy to heretics. But his cruelty extended beyond matters of faith. Edward possessed a vindictive streak that stunned even the toughest courtiers who had witnessed his father's ruthless reign. When servants displeased him, Edward devised cruel punishments that seemed designed less to teach lessons and more to humiliate. One unlucky page who spilled wine on the king's papers was ordered to stand for hours in the courtyard while courtiers, under Edward's exact command, hurled rotten food at him, a public spectacle orchestrated by an 11-year-old monarch. Edward watched these public humiliations with clear satisfaction, often taking detailed notes on his victims' reactions as if conducting cold scientific experiments. His journal entries from this time reveal a mind steadily slipping away from normal, human empathy. He wrote about others suffering with the same clinical detachment he might use to describe the weather, cataloging pain and fear as mere observations rather than tragedies. When a kitchen maid died after being flogged on Edward's orders for allegedly saying Catholic prayers, his only recorded remark was that the punishment was more effective than expected in preventing further errors. Perhaps most chilling was Edward's treatment of his own family, which exposed the depths of his emerging sociopathy. Though he had been raised alongside his sisters, Mary and Elizabeth, Edward showed no genuine affection for either once he became king. Instead, he saw them strictly through his rigid religious lens. Mary as a dangerous Catholic threat who needed to be controlled or eliminated, and Elizabeth as a cautious ally, acceptable only because of her Protestant leanings. To Edward, family ties were nothing more than political calculations. This cold calculation became even clearer when his uncle, Thomas Seymour, tried to win his favor with gifts and flattery. Rather than respond with warmth, Edward viewed these gestures as manipulative and met them with ruthless, measured suspicion. When Thomas Seymour was arrested and charged with treason, Edward not only supported his execution, but is said to have watched coldly from his window as the man who once showed him kindness was dragged to the scaffold. Witnesses recalled the boy king displaying no emotion as the axe fell, instead calmly jotting notes in his journal about the efficiency of various execution methods. As Edward approached his 12th birthday, his authoritarian grip tightened drastically. The once frail bookish boy now took direct control of government decisions, frequently overruling advisers he deemed too soft. His Protestant reforms grew harsher by the day, enforcing mandatory church attendance through an extensive network of informants and imposing brutal penalties for any deviation from the official doctrine. Edward personally crafted a religious surveillance system that would have rivaled even the feared Spanish Inquisition. Neighbors spied on neighbors, and children were rewarded for reporting their own parents' religious offenses. The king's obsession with absolute control extended into every corner of English religious life. He issued detailed decrees dictating not only public worship, but private devotion, specifying how his subjects should pray, what they must believe, and even how they were to think about God. Breaking these rules was considered treason against both crown and deity, punishable by escalating penalties ranging from public humiliation to imprisonment and ultimately, death. The boy king personally reviewed every case brought before him, frequently escalating punishments when he felt the original sentences lacked sufficient zeal for Protestant purity. Edward effectively established an early form of thought police, encouraging citizens to spy on their neighbors' religious practices and rewarding those who successfully denounced supposed heretics. He took a disturbing personal pleasure in reading these reports, often summoning accusers to court to extract even more damning details about their neighbors' alleged sins. Those accused of Catholic sympathies faced harsh penalties, imprisonment, torture, or death, with Edward not only approving, but often intensifying the sentences. Edward's court became a breeding ground for paranoia and fanaticism, where mercy was dismissed as weakness. The machinery of persecution he built was ruthless in its systematic approach and marked by the king's unusual hands-on involvement. Unlike most rulers who might delegate such matters, Edward insisted on personally reviewing every case, meticulously, studying each accused individual's alleged crimes and crafting punishments tailored to their specific theological offenses. His journals from this era read like chilling manuals of religious persecution, filled with detailed evaluations of which punishments worked best for various heresies. What made Edward's reign of terror especially unnerving was his combination of childish inventiveness with deadly seriousness. When traditional punishment seemed inadequate, the teenage king would devise new, often cruel forms of humiliation and suffering, always justified by complex theological arguments. One Catholic priest who refused to renounce his faith was forced, by Edward's direct order, to parade through the streets of London wearing a sign that read, "Enemy of Christ," while children pelted him with stones. The king watched the cruel spectacle from his palace window, reportedly laughing at the priest's torment as he calmly dictated his observations to his secretary. Edward's obsession with religious purity extended mercilessly to his own family, exposing a chilling absence of natural affection. He saw his half-sister Mary, a devout Catholic, not as kin, but as the greatest threat to his vision of a Protestant England. In surviving private letters, Edward's hatred for Mary is both juvenile and terrifying. He called her a bastard and enemy of Christ while scheming to have her declared illegitimate or even executed for heresy. The boy who should have shown brotherly love instead nursed dark fantasies of watching his sister burn at the stake for her beliefs. Edward's animosity toward Mary was far more than political. It consumed him with a personal intensity that alarmed even his most radical advisors. He spent hours plotting ways to legally remove her from the line of succession, consulting with eager Protestant lawyers who found every possible legal pretext to justify what was, in essence, fratricide. Court observers noted, Edward's mood would darken visibly whenever Mary's name was spoken, often retreating to his chambers to compose lengthy treatises on the theological imperative of removing her from the line of succession. The boy king's plans for Mary grew, increasingly detailed and cruel. He meticulously drafted scenarios for her arrest, trial, and execution, outlining specific charges of heresy and treason. Edward even composed what he intended to be Mary's forced confession, demanding she renounce Catholicism and admit to illegitimacy, before granting her the mercy of a swift beheading instead of the more agonizing fate of burning. These chilling documents, now preserved in the royal archives, expose a mind consumed by something far darker than political rivalry, a genuine sociopathic hatred. Edward's attitude toward Elizabeth was more complicated, yet equally unsettling. Though he approved of her Protestant beliefs, he saw his younger sister not as family, but as a mere instrument of his religious agenda. Edward planned to use Elizabeth's future marriage to forge crucial Protestant alliances, caring little for her personal happiness and viewing her primarily as a political pawn. Even his relatively favorable regard for Elizabeth was clouded by his fanaticism, reducing her value entirely to her usefulness in advancing his cause. Edward's inability to form genuine family bonds extended far beyond his siblings to his entire court. He saw his nobles, advisors, and servants not as individuals with worth or feelings, but as mere pawns in his ruthless religious and political game. Even those who had loyally served him for years could be abruptly discarded, or worse, executed, if they failed to show unwavering zeal for his increasingly radical policies. To serve Edward meant total submission to his uncompromising vision of a Protestant England, leaving no room for personal conscience or moral hesitation. When signs of serious illness appeared in early 1553, the king's behavior grew even more erratic and merciless. Instead of softening as death loomed, the 15-year-old monarch became obsessed with securing the survival of his Protestant reforms at any cost. Edward knew that his sister Mary's eventual accession would restore Catholicism, and the thought of his life's work being undone drove him into a frenzy of desperation. His rage at this prospect verged on madness, pushing him toward measures so extreme they would have shocked even his notoriously brutal father. As his health deteriorated, Edward's fanaticism only intensified. Physically weakened, his religious fervor blazed brighter than ever, as if he sought to cram a lifetime of Protestant purification into his final months. Court physicians reported fevered episodes during which the king delivered wild, rambling sermons preaching the need to eradicate Catholic influence, no matter the cost, even if it meant slaughtering every Catholic in England. At first, Edward's fiery outbursts were written off as delirium caused by his worsening illness. But during clearer moments, it became chillingly clear that his extreme declarations were not the ravings of a fevered mind. They reflected his true, dark intentions. Secretly, Edward began meeting with radical Protestant extremists, plotting a coup to bypass both Mary and Elizabeth and place his Protestant cousin, Lady Jane Grey, on the throne. The conspiracy that unfolded was staggering in its boldness and cruelty. It involved plans to arrest, or even assassinate, both of his sisters, and install a puppet government controlled by fanatical Protestants. Despite his frail condition, the 15-year-old king threw himself into these schemes with a zeal that both astonished and terrified his co-conspirators. The details of Edward's final plot laid bare the terrifying depth of his transformation from innocent boy to would-be tyrant. In collaboration with John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, Edward devised a plan that would have led to the deaths of Mary and Elizabeth and ushered in a Protestant regime harsher than any England had ever endured. The conspiracy called for mass executions of Catholic nobles, the confiscation of all Catholic lands, and the creation of a relentless religious police force to oversee every aspect of English life. Edward's personal involvement in orchestrating these brutal measures was meticulous and fueled by an unsettling enthusiasm. In his final weeks, the dying king obsessed over plans that would scar England for generations. With trembling hands, shaken by illness, Edward filled page after page with lists of Catholics to be executed, properties to be confiscated, and laws to enforce his vision of a ruthless Protestant regime. The boy once seen as an innocent pawn had revealed himself as the relentless architect of a religious purge so brutal it would make even the Spanish Inquisition seem merciful by comparison. Yet fate dealt a bitter twist, almost as if divine justice were at work. Modern analysis suggests Edward suffered from a deadly combination of tuberculosis and likely arsenic poisoning, possibly administered by his own doctors in a misguided effort to save him. The cruel irony was impossible to ignore. The king who had poisoned his kingdom with fanatic hatred was himself slowly being poisoned by those sworn to heal him. As the toxins ravaged his body, Edward's mind fractured into hallucinations and bouts of madness, which courtiers interpreted as prophetic religious visions. The boy who had shown no mercy in life endured agonizing torment in death, his body wasting away amid unbearable pain. Physicians noted that instead of softening his spirit, his suffering seemed to inflame his religious zealotry, his physical decay feeding the obsession that consumed his soul. Witnesses to his final days were horrified. The king's body began to emit a terrible stench weeks before he died. His skin turned a sickly green, a clear sign of severe poisoning. His hair and nails fell out, and violent convulsions racked his weakening frame, leaving him temporarily paralyzed. A tragic and terrifying end to a young monarch whose reign had spiraled into darkness. Once hailed as the most beautiful of Henry VIII's children, the boy king had become a twisted, grotesque shadow of his former self. His body convulsed in rebellion against the poison slowly claiming his life. Yet perhaps the most chilling aspect was his clarity. Edward remained painfully aware of his impending death, spending his final days caught between agonized screams of pain and fevered, obsessive rants about Protestant martyrs. His last lucid moments held no hint of forgiveness or peace. Instead, Edward expressed deep regret that he would not live to see his ruthless vision for England fulfilled. He implored his conspirators to carry on their dark mission without him, assuring them that divine reward awaited those faithful enough to establish his Protestant paradise. Edward's final hours were a haunting, twisted spectacle. Far from the tender deathbed scene of love and reconciliation one might expect, rather than offering forgiveness or affection, he cursed his Catholic sister with venomous fury, praying for God to shield Protestant England from what he called her wickedness. Witnesses recalled his last words were filled with hatred, a grim and fitting conclusion to a life marked by relentless fanaticism and ruthless ambition. When Edward finally died on July 6, 1553, the relief among his courtiers was almost tangible, though few dared to express it openly. The boy king who had promised to be England's savior had instead become its nightmare, and his death marked the kingdom's only escape from the escalating extremism that threatened to plunge the nation into civil war. Even his most loyal supporters privately admitted that Edward's passing might have been a mercy for England, though such thoughts were never spoken aloud. In the days following his death, it became clear just how reliant Edward's radical plans had been on his personal authority. Without his forceful will at the helm, the conspiracy unraveled swiftly. Lady Jane Grey, the intended beneficiary of Edward's coup, found herself abandoned as moderate Protestants recoiled from the extremist plot, and nobles suddenly discovered pressing matters elsewhere. Mary's claim to the throne gained widespread support, not only from Catholics but also from moderate Protestants, horrified by the dark turn Edward's reign had taken. The boy king who once dreamed of becoming England's greatest Protestant champion had instead secured a legacy defined by cruelty and the widespread relief that followed his death. Even devoted Protestants welcomed Catholic Mary as a preferable alternative to the harsh fanaticism that had gripped the nation. The irony of Edward's reign goes beyond his failed succession. His relentless persecution of moderate Protestant voices left English Protestantism dominated by zealots who alienated everyday believers. By the time of his death, many English Protestants saw Catholicism less as an enemy and more as a refuge from the rigid demands of Edward's vision of religious purity. Modern historians have begun to reassess Edward VI's reign, revealing a far darker reality than the traditional view of a frail boy, merely manipulated by ambitious courtiers. Surviving court records and private letters paint a portrait of a young king who was not only complicit in persecution, but seemed to derive unsettling satisfaction from the suffering of others. Edward's direct involvement in orchestrating executions, along with his meticulously kept journals detailing methods of torture, suggests that England was effectively ruled for 6 years by a child psychopath wielding unchecked power. His transformation from an innocent boy to a ruthless tyrant offers a chilling case study in how absolute authority can corrupt absolutely. Unlike adult monarchs who might retain some empathy or political pragmatism, Edward's profound isolation from normal human bonds and his unwavering belief in his divine right to rule created a perfect storm of cruelty. The boy who had never been told no and who viewed any dissent as sinful became capable of brutal acts that shocked even the hardened Tudor court. Contemporary observers reported growing fear among his courtiers, who felt helpless to rein in the young king's increasingly extreme behavior. The very doctrine of divine right that legitimized Edward's authority also rendered opposition not just treasonous, but blasphemous, effectively silencing any resistance, even from those closest to him. The boy king had fashioned a system where even his smallest whim instantly became law, and his escalating appetite for cruelty faced no restraint other than death itself. Perhaps the most chilling question is what might have unfolded had Edward lived into adulthood. His vision for Protestant England included creating a permanent religious police force, eradicating the Catholic nobility entirely, and establishing a surveillance state that would intrusively monitor every detail of his subjects' private lives. Though he died young in 1553, Edward had already begun implementing these harsh policies on a limited scale, and there is little doubt that a mature Edward VI would have forged one of history's most oppressive regimes. His legacy serves as a stark reminder that evil can spring from the most unlikely sources, and that even the noblest intentions can be twisted by unchecked power and religious fanaticism. The boy king who believed he was saving England's soul nearly destroyed its body, and his death may have been the greatest mercy his reign could offer. His story remains a powerful cautionary tale about the dangers of absolute authority combined with ideological certainty, especially when wielded by someone too young to grasp the full consequences of their actions. Edward's story highlights the perilous crossroads where youth, power, and rigid ideology collide. Unlike adult tyrants who might be tempered by political pragmatism or personal bonds, Edward's utter isolation and unshakable conviction in his own righteousness drove him to contemplate horrors that even seasoned political players found appalling. The child who should have been playing with toys was instead orchestrating mass executions and religious purges, treating human lives as mere expendables in his relentless pursuit of religious purity. His reign reveals how education can become indoctrination when stripped of balance and compassion. Edward's tutors shaped a brilliant theological mind, but one devoid of empathy, a moral monster capable of crafting intricate justifications for cruelty, yet utterly disconnected from basic human kindness. His story stands as a stark warning against educational systems that value ideological zeal over humanity. Ultimately, Edward VI's short reign remains one of history's most unsettling examples of power corrupting innocence. The boy who started as Henry VIII's beloved heir, ending as a figure so feared that his death was greeted with relief rather than mourning. Edward VI's transformation from a sheltered child into a would-be tyrant exposes unsettling truths about human nature and the unique dangers of those who justify cruelty as serving a higher cause. His death marked not only the end of a life but also the collapse of what might have been England's darkest chapter. The boy king's final days, racked with pain and consumed by hatred even for his own family, stand as a grim and fitting close to a reign that had promised hope but delivered only fear. In his premature death, Edward may have unwittingly offered England his greatest mercy, sparing the nation from the full devastation of his brutal vision.